Let me now introduce George Megalogenis. George is a renowned writer on politics, economics, and social impact. And we're really looking to hear from George today about his reflections and his thinking about what is the impact of the pandemic and what that means for the future. So thank you very much, George. Over to you.
And Mary, thank you for the pre-introduction. And also I pay my respects to Indigenous elders and leaders emerging. And condolences obviously on everyone in the Afghan Australian community and services who were affected by the horrible incident overnight outside Kabul airport. Quite a challenging time at the moment we're obviously all living in. There's a sense that the pandemic and all the world's events bending, shaping, accelerating, pausing, snap freezing, the very concept of time. And what I want to do with this particular presentation is just walk you through a couple of tricky parts that I had to face in preparing the quarterly essay, and then building from that, which the essay came out a couple of months ago now, and just building from that to give you my reflections on where I think the country is at the moment and where we might be going with COVID. Now, for those of you who remember the date that the infection was recorded for that poor limousine driver who, through no fault of his own, picked up an infectious traveller from what we think was a FedEx plane, pilot and crew. The infection was reported on the 16th of June in Sydney. He wasn't wearing a mask and he wasn't vaccinated. I happened to have hit send, hit print on the essay on the 7th of June, which was 9 days before the announcement. And the essay itself was published on the 28th of June, which is obviously 3 weeks after we went to print, and a good 2 days, only 2 days after the first of the city lockdowns commenced. The first of the sort of extended lockdown we've seen in Sydney, which went to New South Wales, ACT, and of course now here I'm speaking to you from the den or the cave in Melbourne. So that sort of bottom half of Australia, the southeast corner of Australia, is in lockdown, obviously, as we speak. But when I reflect on that 3-week period and the course of the pandemic being altered in the middle of that, would have been very difficult, obviously, as a writer to anticipate a shift that dramatic in real time. But I did take out some insurance, fortunately for me. And I did mention that the possibility of a third wave of the coronavirus requiring another extended lockdown would test the electorate's patience. An easy paragraph to write to protect yourself, but obviously I couldn't have predicted how that third wave and the extended lockdown might have manifested itself. Certainly couldn't have anticipated on the 7th or even on the 28th of June when the essay published, and I was doing some media, that New South Wales would be caught so far behind this particular outbreak, the Delta variant of the coronavirus. So I'll just say that by way of preamble, almost, if I can, without extending the metaphor too much, to inoculate myself about the possibility that some of the things I raise with you today might be very difficult to defend even in a week or two if events take another dramatic course. So I am mindful of the time we're operating in, but I think we've seen enough over the 18 months to be able to make some pretty big calls about the electorate, the possibility of the next election being either a pro-incumbent election or quite a dramatic course shift to a Labor victory, and a new set of considerations for your sector and for the education more generally, and for industry. So I will talk a bit about the electoral math in a second, but first I want to just remind us the glass half full in our experience of COVID, and then to use that to piggyback to the dangers in the present tense, the dangers we face in the present tense. We still, when we look up those global league tables, if we just take the OECD, the 38 members of the OECD, New Zealand has the lowest death rate in the OECD, and we still have the second lowest death rate in the OECD. If you do pro rata, say the American or the British death rate onto the Australian population, you get 50,000 deaths, not fewer than 1,000. So that's just the order of magnitude we're operating in. I think when historians look back on this period, they'll still identify a country like Australia and a country like New Zealand, our neighbour New Zealand, as a success story. But when we flip that table and look at vaccination rates, among the OECD, we are ranked 35th out of the 38 at the moment. That is double dose, 2 jabs in the arm for fully vaccinated populations. And New Zealand is at the very bottom. Now, we know from the last couple of months that the danger that poses coming into our Southern Hemisphere winters is that you get another outbreak. And you get an outbreak with the Delta variant that is very, very difficult to suppress. Now, I'm not going to be passing judgment on any particular state, territory or other countries managing of these particular variants, but will say from an economist's perspective, the thing I didn't foresee in the quarterly essay, which is actually historic when you think it through, there is the possibility of Australia and certainly New Zealand, but we'll concentrate on Australia obviously, slipping into another recession. Now, the idea that Australia will double dip and slip into another recession, induced obviously by the lockdown in New South Wales and its spread to the second largest state, Victoria, and also the ACT, roughly half the nation's population going off the grid. The idea that we would slip into a second recession through this global pandemic, it was very difficult to foresee in the middle of the year because your economic history tells you that Australia catches a cold when either the US or more recently China sneezes. So our recessions tend to be imported. They start somewhere else. One of the two big players in the global economy. In the 20th century, obviously, the US, the largest economy on the planet, if it fell into a recession, it was very difficult for Australia to avoid a recession. China now, the world's largest trading nation in the 21st century, whether they meant to or not, they brought on the global recession in the first quarter and the second quarter of 2020 through their lockdown and the subsequent lockdowns around the rest of the world to handle the coronavirus, to cope with the coronavirus. Now, we know the rest of the world is reopening, partly because the world is in a position to reopen because it's almost exhausted by the virus. The virus has burnt through their populations and they're having freedom days and they're having all the sorts of things we associate with a return to some sort of normal, which is a large gathering of people watching soccer, going to a concert at Central Park, going back to restaurants, travelling across state and international borders. We're not in that position now, and we know why we're not in that position now, because we did well in 2020, but we're also not at vaccination levels now required to be able to open up safely. So very unique circumstance of us almost forcing ourselves into the possibility of another recession at a time when the global economy is open. Now, I can't find another precedent in economic history for something like that happening to a small trading nation like Australia. Either we go into recession because the rest of the world is in it, or we figure out a way to avoid it, like we did during the GFC when we were the last rich nation standing in the OECD not to face a recession. Or we fall hard or we fall softer. This time around, it looks like we're going down again at the time when the rest of the world is opening up. Now, that poses a number of immediate political questions for me because it's very difficult to see what a re-election narrative is for a Commonwealth government if they go to an election, say, March next year, in the week, say, that the national accounts confirm that there was a negative quarter in December, to go with the quarter that we're already in, September quarter, the Treasury have forecast. I think at the moment the forecast contraction of about 2 percentage points. So if we have another one in December, the headlines in March next year when Scott Morrison will probably be looking for his best case scenario to call an election, the headlines then and there will be recession. That's if it happens. Now, I'm not calling it, but the possibility is certainly a live one. Now, we don't have, apart from Robert Menzies in 1961, an example of a federal government seeking re-election in the teeth of a recession being able to be re-elected. But, and this is a big but, and I do put a caveat on this particular electoral scenario. COVID's taught us one thing. if COVID's taught us one thing, it is some of the old rules, some of the old associations between living standards and how people vote are suspended because what is front of mind is your personal safety, the health of your community, the health of the state, and the health of the nation. So that would be subject to all those caveats. I think we're looking at a really tricky re-election scenario for the government, but the possibility, even with lockdown leading to an extended lockdown leading to recession, the possibility that they may still be able to talk their way out of it. Now, how would they talk their way out of it? I think the Prime Minister gave us a bit of a hint this week. He will be talking to the future and the possibility of opening up again. So whenever an election is held, he'll still be talking about a brighter future ahead. Now, he's trying to frame, it's a very interesting story he's trying to tell this week. This week, he's trying to frame the Labor states as the states, WA, Queensland, to a lesser extent Victoria, because he and Dan Andrews now probably back on the same page again after some serious difficulty last year. He's trying to frame the Labor premiers as wishing eternal lockdown because they don't want to take the risk of living with COVID. The risk of living with COVID is obviously present in New South Wales and to a lesser extent in Victoria and the ACT. It's easy to tell voters in those two states in the Territory, we plan to open up at some point because we want to be able to at some point live with this virus. We can't be locked down forever. That message would resonate there. He also wants to tell voters in WA, especially because WA is the most important, it's an important block in the electoral map, which I'll explain to you in a sec. He wants to tell voters, especially in WA, that you can't stay locked away forever. Otherwise, you get left behind. Now, Western Australians may not think that way at the moment, but who knows where we'll be in March next year, especially if the virus somehow escapes into the community in Perth. Now, I've got a bit of data to share with you, and please excuse me while I flip through some of the pages. But the economic shock that we're viewing at the moment, that we're sort of living through at the moment, which is really just the first cut of the data beginning with the Sydney lockdown of 28th of June to the end of July. So we've only got really a 5-week window to test what is actually happening in the real economy at the moment and what is happening. The best way to measure it, obviously, not necessarily retail sales or foot traffic, but jobs. And the ABS do have, and many of you will be aware of this, the ABS have two data sets. They have the gold standard, as they call it, monthly labour force survey, but they've also got real-time payroll data. And they release the payroll data. It's 10 million transactions each week, which are reported to from employers, which are reported to the tax office, are very quickly cut into a data set that gives you a feel for how employment is tracking in real time. Now, just in the last 5 weeks in Sydney, we've seen in Sydney, and I'll start with the capital cities. In Sydney, we've seen just under 9% of the entire labour force laid off. Now, 9% is an epic number to let go of people in a 5-week period. It is almost equivalent to the proportion of people who were let go in that first lockdown, the first national lockdown in March and April of May of 2020. At the moment, Sydney is 6.6 percentage points behind in terms of the number of people in work than it had before the first lockdown last year. So to all intents and purposes, Sydney is in recession as we speak. The rest of New South Wales is also behind where it was, but only a fraction behind where it was in May last year. So that, even though they've had a dip in the last 5 weeks, over the course of the last 18 months, that line is pretty much flat. Melbourne, surprisingly, Melbourne still has more jobs at the end of June than it did in May last year. But again, that's a flat line. As it is in the rest of Victoria, which has taken a bit more of a dip than Melbourne this time around. Brisbane, by the way, still has more jobs than it did this time, than it did in March last year, as does the rest of Queensland. Hold that thought for a moment. Adelaide as well has more jobs now than it did last year. Hold that thought as well for a moment. And Perth is booming. Perth has 5 percentage points, 5% more people in work today than it did in March last year. It is the only capital city that hasn't gone backwards in the last 5 weeks. The reason why I asked you to hold the thoughts on both Queensland, South Australia and WA, is that these three states, and these three states matter a lot in the opening vaccination freedom equation that the Prime Minister talks about at the moment. These three states are already free. Sorry, I'll give you some air quotes. These states are already free to all intents and purposes. They are already open. And the jobs data tells you that they're still growing. Now, the national story, which is the national story when we get to 70% vaccination and then 80% vaccination, which is part of that national plan we hear a lot about at the moment. That national story implies that by the time you get to 80%, there is free movement of vaccinated people around Australia, and there is the beginnings of overseas travel, vaccinated overseas travel into Australia. Students and skilled workers with particular visas, international students and skilled workers with particular visas. So for the southeast corner of Australia, which has unfortunately been living with COVID in quite a visceral way for the last couple of weeks, the idea of being open, whether it's later this year or early next year, with some COVID one in the community isn't as intimidating as it is for WA, South Australia and Queensland, and even Tasmania, although Tasmania in the equation. The reason being is that the states that don't have COVID at the moment have already done the job that they think they were asked to do, which is to suppress and eliminate the virus. So when we talk about reopening towards the end of this year and into next year, we are asking 4 states and another territory as well, which is the Northern Territory, with virtually zero COVID at the moment, to accept some COVID. Now, the difficulty for each of the premiers and for the Chief Minister in those respective jurisdictions is that the last COVID death in each of these places was well over a year ago. Queensland did have a COVID case, which was an overseas a return traveller who passed away tragically in April this year. But between Tasmania, South Australia, Queensland and Western Australia, the last COVID deaths from the first wave were in April and May last year. So reopening towards the end of this year and into next year pretty much implies, it may not happen, but pretty much implies that the states in the southeast where COVID might still be bubbling away at some point or another are going to be transferring a case into these COVID-free states, and they may get their first death in a year or more. Now, I can't calculate what the political reaction is there, but it does make the political equation at a federal election, because the next government that faces the people is Scott Morrison's government. It's not any of the states or territories. Scott Morrison is pretty much next, unless the South Australians go before then. So in that situation, when we're looking at electoral equations, you have to start to break the federal pendulum between the states and the territories. And something very unusual happens when you look at the pendulum. I tend to avoid making predictions, and I don't look at opinion polls, but when I do look at the electoral pendulum, I see a number of marginal Labor seats located in New South Wales outside of Sydney, which Scott Morrison would still be eyeing off as buffers to defend his government against the expected loss of some seats somewhere else. So I see there's 4 of the 10 most marginal seats that Labor holds are in New South Wales. 4 of those 10 marginal seats requiring swings of less than 2% to transfer across to the government. The government, on the other hand, has a number of marginal seats in the places where you would least expect them. There's a couple in Tasmania, there's 1 in South Australia, and there's 1 in Western Australia. You see where I'm going with this particular thought. The states been asked to reopen at a time of zero COVID, when they would consider that they're already free, have a number of marginal seats held by the government, which would come into immediate risk if there's even a COVID, it doesn't have to be a COVID wave for it to create anxiety at the community level around the time of the election, especially if an election is called with the Rear Vision mirror telling us we've been in recession. New South Wales, though, a reopening equation could well and truly get Scott Morrison picking up Labor seats. If people are grateful that this horrible thing is finally behind us and we can start thinking about living our lives again. So I'm just giving you that particular overview to give you a sense of the volatility. And this volatility is not anything that I can make a prediction on 5-6 months out, but it's just to give you a framework for thinking, to expect that swings will be going in both directions, But the COVID story will pull rank at some point or another in every state and territory, and that the economy, whilst it's our theory tells us that you get your health response right, you eventually get the economic response right. By the time the next federal election is held, the economy would have been subjected to stresses and strains for more than 2 years. And there will be structural change in the labour force. There'll be structural change in the relationships between capital cities and the rest of states and between the states themselves, which are going to permanently alter the trajectory for Australia from that point on. Now, what do I mean by that? Every recession that we've had up until the 21st century has involved some level of pain for either Victoria or New South Wales, and a transfer of power, transfer of resources, transfer of workers through interstate migration to the frontier states, WA and Queensland. Interestingly enough, when I look at the data of the previous recessions, the mid-70s, the early 80s, the 1990s, the one thing that stands out above all others, so whether New South Wales or Victoria are at the epicentre, there is almost a counter-narrative in the frontier states, especially in Queensland, where you don't actually see a recession through the period of a national recession. You see the job market either holding up or having a slight uptick. And that is fed by internal migration. Now, the internal migration story, you may already have seen the biggest shock of all in 2020, close to 40,000 people left Victoria. Sorry, close to 40,000 more people left Victoria than came the other way, not just from interstate, but from overseas as well. We had a net emigration out of Victoria, which has no comparison outside of the 1890s home bust. Is quite a big chart. The chart literally does that, falls off the cliff. New South Wales has only fallen half the distance, but it's still fallen quite dramatically. Just under 10,000 people left New South Wales in net terms in 2020 alone. Now, when I look at what our history tells us about how Australia and the labour market and the local economies realign themselves in recession and come out the other end, Queensland is obviously picking up, and you've already seen it in the data I flagged earlier, which is the job data for the last 5 weeks. Queensland's been picking up people, especially from New South Wales and to a lesser extent from Victoria. WA is, for all intents and purposes at the moment, at full employment. And it's very difficult to imagine you have a state at full employment at the point at which the national economy is about to lurch back into another recession, its second recession, just over 18 months. So those things are, those regional differences, those regional stories are very important, I think, for your sector to keep in mind when you think about what it is your local community and your jurisdiction is asking you to do, not just through this shock, but where you end up at the other end. Now, the reason why, again, I'm flagging some of these regional variations is that whilst COVID has sort of warped them, they are still telling us a story that you can rely on the past to identify familiar patterns. So this is not a new pattern. This is an accelerated and exaggerated pattern from previous recessions. But the thing that I always keep in mind is what happens when we finally do reopen. Wherever we get to this particular point of normalcy, whatever normalcy is in 2022. With the international borders, and we look at the point at which the international borders are open again as some form of new normal. What do Melbourne and Sydney do at that point after they've been through Melbourne, obviously the epicentre of the second wave, Sydney the epicentre of the third wave? What do they do as they try to reassert themselves in the national economy? Do they start drawing young people back to the cities, or is there a shift from city to region which is permanent? And this is not just a lifestyle shift, but young people have been spooked out of the capital cities, spooked out of the congestion, spooked out of the elevated property prices, and relocated themselves in the regions. And if you think about the cohorts that you're educating, you may well be looking at, and you should know this data in real time, you may well be looking at fundamental shifts across your sector in terms of where people choose to live and work and want to study. That is one thing that's up in the air, but it's one thing that think people need to consider seriously. But the other thing, and this is the other big question mark, Melbourne and Sydney at some point are going to want to get their people back. And if they can't get their people back, they're going to look overseas again, where the majority of their population growth is coming in the decade leading up to COVID. The decade leading up to COVID is quite an interesting decade if you think about how fast our country had changed. COVID's obviously causing a lot more disturbance and sort of setting us in slightly different paths. But the decade before COVID was an epic decade unto itself, and some of those patterns I suspect will re-emerge again in 2022. What happened in that decade before COVID? We had the sort of not petering out, but the peaking of the mining boom, and a transfer of economic activity primarily in Melbourne and to a lesser extent in Sydney. Population of Greater Melbourne grew by 1 million over that decade, from just under 4 million to just under 4 million in 2009, just over 5 million in 2019. Across the course of that decade, Melbourne was the fastest growing city or regional town in Australia, off that base of nearly 4 million to 5 million. So it grew faster than the Gold Coast. It grew faster than the Sunshine Coast. Geelong, the second city in Victoria, was the third fastest. So Melbourne was first, Sunshine Coast was second, Geelong was third, the Gold Coast was fourth. That decade of growth, especially down here in Victoria and obviously in Queensland, patterns that may not necessarily repeat from 2022, but if Melbourne can get back on the overseas migration horse and if Sydney can get back on the overseas migration course, then you have a very, very interesting tension re-emerging in Australia. That previous decade, predominantly the growth across the country began from the inner city and then moved out to the west, or in Queensland's case, to the southwest. So Melbourne's inner city, Sydney's inner city, Melbourne's west, Sydney's west. That wasn't the order. The west grew faster than the city, but those two areas, so we had diversity going up and we had sprawl going out for both those capital cities, most of it driven by overseas migration. What it did was change it wasn't just the relative power of Melbourne and Sydney compared to the rest of Australia. It actually changed the composition of our ethnic base in a way that when I've talked, some of you may have heard me talk about this before, but I think COVID isn't going to shift this. COVID isn't going to bring us back to where we were in the 1990s or even the first decade of the 21st century. The shift that occurred in the second decade of the 21st century, and it's a shift that hasn't occurred, by definition, it hasn't occurred before, it's historic. Melbourne became the first city with someone other than English at the very top of the ethnic ladder. And that's when the Indians went to number one and the Chinese went to number two. So this is overseas born population. Indians 1, Chinese 2, English born 3. Sydney had the Chinese on top. On the trends leading up to lockdown, the Indians were just about to click over to number 2 with English in number 3. So our two biggest cities have a Eurasian ethnic face before lockdown. Our two biggest cities, when they do reopen, are probably going to be looking again, not necessarily to China, but certainly to India to restock their population. Why does this thing matter? No other part of Australia looks like Melbourne and Sydney at the moment. Everywhere else you look in Australia, there is somebody else at the top of the overseas born population. In Brisbane, it's the New Zealanders. In Darwin, it's people born in the Philippines. In Perth, it's young people from England. And it's a very important distinction because in Adelaide, it's old people from England, from the previous wave of migration. And in Hobart, it's old people from England. In Canberra at the moment, the English are first, the Indians are second, the Chinese are third. That is what the nation at large looks like. And Canberra is the only city that looks like the nation at large. Everywhere else is different. Now, when everywhere else is different, we have difficulty pulling that country back together again, not because of the ethnic differences, but what had been driving the difference. What had been driving the difference was a lot of young people from overseas clustering in our big cities, beginning with Melbourne, then Sydney, and to a lesser extent parts of Brisbane, not all of Brisbane, whilst the rest of the country was growing via other means. WA is growing from overseas migration from the mother country, from old England. but they're young people. Adelaide wasn't really growing at all. In fact, Adelaide, to all intents and purposes, was looking like a country town for most of that decade leading up to COVID. Hobart wasn't growing much at all. The regions were growing, but the regions were growing for different reasons. The regions were growing because older people were leaving the city for the country, and younger people were going in the other direction to places like Melbourne and Sydney. There's one particular stat, I always quote this one off the top of my head, but it's still a fascinating one for what it revealed of our growth drivers in the decade leading up to COVID. Melbourne added, as I mentioned, a million people over the course of that last decade. Adelaide only added 100,000. Pretty much all the growth in Adelaide came from overseas because it had to. All that growth came from overseas because Adelaide had more young people leaving than it added to a population through net natural increase. Think about this. A capital city had more of its young people leaving than it was making in babies each year. And most of those young people ended up in Melbourne. Melbourne, of course, did grow by that million. 2/3 of Melbourne's population growth came from overseas. That means the balance, that 1/3, 10 percentage points came from interstate migration, and the rest came from net natural increase. It was a Goldilocks equation. The only city at the moment in COVID that has a Goldilocks equation, but the two of them, Perth and Brisbane. Perth and Brisbane are growing because they're getting people from other parts of Australia. No one's getting in from overseas, but they're getting people from other parts of Australia. The reason why Melbourne added 1 million and Adelaide could only add 100,000, because Melbourne received 8 out of every 10 migrants from overseas that chose either Melbourne or Sydney. So whilst Adelaide needed to rely totally on overseas migration for its growth, it couldn't get enough of them to keep up with Melbourne. These trends have been suspended by COVID. The interstate migration story, which are the cross currents of migration, the internal cross currents of migration, with the cessation of the overseas migration rate, have changed some of the relativities between states and territories. But that big wave will come back. It comes back in 2022, then in 2023, then in 2024. You'll have Melbourne, Sydney, possibly Brisbane if it can keep up, becoming even more Eurasian than the rest of the country. These are things that are, in one respect, interest and excite me as a sort of social observer, but concern me as a citizen, because I'm not sure our political system is equipped to cope with that diversity. I don't think it was handling that diversity well before COVID. I think it will struggle to handle that diversity after COVID. Now, by diversity, I don't mean ethnicity. And I think I need to underline this point. I don't mean ethnicity. By diversity, I mean age. The big wedge, the big divide in Australia leading up to COVID was between those parts of Australia that could attract and retain young people, and the other parts of Australia that almost had to fall back on growth from interstate migration from retirees and the like. You know this across your sector. You know the diversity within your cohorts, and you know if you do the sums, even though all your intakes almost by definition young, you know that in some of the regional areas, your catchment area is tiny because there aren't that many young people. You know, in the cities, there are a lot more young people. I know this sounds obvious, but it's a problem politics have been putting off dealing with for quite a while. And it's something I think that COVID has put, I think, for federal and certainly state leaders, placed a pause on it when they should actually be thinking about it keenly. They should be thinking about the distribution of the population. They should be thinking about how to prevent, when we reopen again, a restoration of a migration-led bubble in Melbourne or Sydney, whilst the rest of the country can barely keep up. Now, just one last bit of data, because I'm going to give you obviously a chance for questions, and I have to, it's just after 10 past 11. I do have to take my leave at 11:30 sharp because I've got to write a column. But it's a very busy day. And I will be catching up on the National Cabinet, but I don't need to worry about it just this minute. The thing I see when I look at the last 5 weeks, and this is quite a shock that we will still have to process, which is the national cost of this particular wave, the third wave, beginning in Sydney. Last year, the economy sort of functioned, notwithstanding Victoria going off the grid for 3 months. because there were two things happening. The other 5 states and the 2 territories were relatively open whilst Victoria was in lockdown. The other thing is, once COVID had been successfully eliminated in Victoria, Victoria came back on the grid, and we had that big surge in activity towards the end of last year. We know that close to 1 million jobs were lost in sort of headcount terms and this isn't counting the ones who also went to zero hours, but we know close to 1 million jobs were lost in headcount terms between February and May last year, and all those jobs were restored, not each individual job, but the labour market in total was able to create an extra 1 million jobs in the reopening from June through to about April and May. June last year through about April, May this year. No other precedent for a dip that severe and a recovery that quick. The difficulty with this third lockdown is it's sending a lot of these sectors back to the position they were. It's sending a lot of, because I'm going to divide it for you by industry. It's sending a lot of these industry back to where they were in March without the promise of a thing like JobKeeper and without the possibility of what Prime Minister used to call a snapback. Without the possibility, without the promise that the virus is going to be eliminated again and we can live freely again afterwards. The payroll data tells you at the moment, compared to March 2020, that the airlines have lost a third of all staff. Big number, 33%. The accommodation sector is down 15%. Motion picture sound recording, also down 15%. Food and beverage services, so restaurants, down 15%. Education hasn't done as badly on an industry level. It's only about 4 or 5% down, but that's still a recession for the education sector. At the moment, the last 5 weeks have been felt hardest in preschool and school education, followed by tertiary education and adult community and other education. So the sectors that we worried about at the beginning of lockdown last year are still the sectors we worry about now. And these are the sectors that may be permanently altered by COVID. Now, the flip side of the equation is some sectors are actually booming. Parts of the retail trade, the retail sector is still booming. The professions are still booming. They're still holding their heads up, notwithstanding the Sydney lockdown, because obviously a lot of professionals can work from home. But more importantly, and this is where I think you need to think about the restructure in a more permanent sense, healthcare, disability care, aged care, are employing many more people than they did last year, and will continue to need to employ many more people than they do now, even after COVID is out of the system. Because the first and last thing I think that COVID's taught us is the priority that the government and the market need to place on health. Now, those things are things that can't necessarily be directed by market forces. They are things that governments have to set the initial price signal. Now, I use a phrase, I sort of didn't quite use this phrase, and I sort of came to the phrase after I published the quarterly essay. I think we're looking at a reactivation of government, which I did mention in the quarterly essay, but the phrase that I'm sort of looking for, which came to me afterwards, is that we're actually looking at a situation where we're starting to contract in services that were previously trusted to the market. Aged care is the prime example, but I also think in early learning, certainly in disability care, we're looking at a horizon in the next 5-10 years where the labour market is going to be forced, partly for political reasons, but partly through just visceral needs, placing health and care above all other things. The labour force is going to need to take a really big adjustment to prioritise care over things that we used to do in the services sector, like travel, eating out, mass events, the arts and the like. It's problematic for me to put it to you in those terms, but I think that this is almost a permanent shift. And this is a permanent shift in the labour force that goes with a permanent shift in our federation to the frontier states, with the possibility, obviously, of a new divide reopening once the borders reopen with Melbourne and Sydney breaking away again from the rest of the country. A lot of balls in the air at the moment. I just hope that gives you a framework for thinking about the present and the future in a way that maybe you know in the micro, but you haven't had a chance to hear it as sort of a national framing device before. I'm going to pass on to Jenny now to handle the questions. We've got about 10 minutes. Maybe we can go just a little over time, but I do need to be away by 11:30. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you very much for that very stimulating presentation around the changing nature of our states, the changing movement of population. Interesting, your terminology around diversity. I think for many of us that is an interesting reflection on where youth is. As someone who's been recently around a lot of our states, you do see that difference quite poignantly when you're actually there often. So I'm going to open up now for questions. Ron, I don't think there were any questions in the chat.
No, that's correct. But I'm sure people will have questions and raising their hand, and happy to have those.
So please, if you do have a question, raise your hand electronically. I think, Mary, you raised it physically, and we'll go to you first. And then we'll look between Ron and I, we'll keep a lookout for who's got a hand raised electronically. Over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks, George. It was really very stimulating, as Jenny said. In particular, I think from my perspective, and I think the sector's perspective, the focus on demographics and what that means for us into the future. But my question, it's one that probably you haven't got an answer to, but I'd be interested in your comments on what do you see as the long-term effect on the federated model, in particular of what we've seen after the last 2 years. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking a lot about this, but maybe I've already flagged in my presentation that too many things are still changing in COVID to make a hard and fast prediction. But we can observe the last 18 months, the premiers and the chief ministers have asserted power in a way that we haven't seen in their federations, certainly since the 70s. So when I've sort of been before my sort of adult memory, but certainly my historical memory, because I've read up a lot about the decade before I came into political journalism. And one of the big tensions you see with the election of the Whitlam government, certainly going into the Fraser government, is that relationship between the Commonwealth and the states. Now, Gough obviously was very keen on setting national priorities in areas of infrastructure, in areas of education, and in areas of planning. And the states and territories, well, certainly there's a couple of premiers in particular. Joh Bjelke-Petersen, who was most prominent in this, did everything they could to trip this guy up. So they exercised power in I would say that Joh especially exercised power in a malignant way. Tricked up the numbers in the Senate, took him on in a way that made Labor, in fact, he was quite successful at it politically, made Labor unelectable in Queensland. In 75, Labor were left with just a single seat, which was Bill Hayden's. They were wiped out. So that's the last time I've seen a premier do what some of the premiers are doing now, but they're doing it obviously from a different vantage point. They're doing it from an exercise of positive power, not negative power. They're not abstracting the rise of Commonwealth power, the trend of centralisation that sort of predated Gough, but really began with Gough. What they're doing is is pulling levers that were always there for them in the Constitution. They run health, they run education, they also run the police forces to enforce lockdowns. The Prime Minister, he realised early on that he couldn't tell them what to do, and nor was it in his political interest at the start of that lockdown last year to start picking fights with them. He did pick a fight with Dan Andrews during the Victorian lockdown, but you see even the way now he's sort of dancing around them. This week was quite an interesting week. This week he wanted to reframe the discussion about the future and the risk equation. He wanted to paint Labor as the state of eternal lockdowns, but didn't want to go and name any of the individual Labor premiers. He was trying to pretend that this was Anthony Albanese's policy. So when you hear a Prime Minister do what he did this week, there's a particular moment in an interview on Perth radio where the interviewer asked him off the top of the head, "Are you saying Mark McGowan is keeping us in caves?" And he said, "No, not Mark McGowan, Anthony Albanese." So you see an acknowledgement of a power shift there, and that language is shared. what does it mean going forward? I think your next big reform, whatever your next big reform is in the intersection between federal and state responsibilities. And it's in places like aged care and it's in places like education. Your next big reforms, and this is why I was referring to this idea of contracting in, I think your next big reform will be the Commonwealth finally deciding these mix of responsibilities between the states is in no one's interest. They hold the checkbook, the states can deliver the services on the ground. I will now fund and contract them to do more than they used to do. And we won't be mucking around with these ideas of contracting out to the private sector. I think this is, even if you get parties changing at elections, even you get different premiers with different mindsets, chief ministers with different mindsets. I think once power is exercised by a jurisdiction, that power is not easily given up. How it manifests itself in future, I can't predict now, but just the dynamic is different now. One asterisk, and this is one asterisk only, and I think there's something peculiar to the time and place that we're in now, that a Commonwealth leader in a pandemic, coming off the back of a government that had already sacked itself twice. Remember, the coalition got rid of Tony Abbott and then Malcolm Turnbull. Scott Morrison uniquely came to power, not disempowered, but with less authority, I think, than any Conservative Prime Minister before him. And they are traditionally a states' rights party. So I think those two things sort of put you in a situation where the states were going to exercise more power. Now, if he'd been in the game a little longer, if he had the experience of a John Howard or a Bob Hawke, and experience and authority of a John Howard, Bob Hawke or Paul Keating, there is no way he would have let the premiers leave those early national cabinet discussions to announce what the lockdown policy was. He would have kept them locked up until they had an agreement, and then he would have walked out with them. Now, that's just statecraft. That's not something that he could have learned on the run. And I think given the speed at which the pandemic was operating and challenging us, I don't think either party would have thought much about what they were doing at that point. Now, of course, we're in this situation where each premier looks at their polling and they see that they're 10 or 15 percentage points ahead of the Prime Minister. So whether the answer is no or whether the answer is yes, or whether it's my idea or I don't want your idea, they're in a position where they haven't been since the 70s. And that going forward is going to be very, very interesting dynamic to test. It's really the watch this space, I think, across all policy.
George, I can't see anybody else with a hand up. Is that right, Ron? No one else. So I'd like to ask you a question. You referred to the regions, and I do think as TAFEs, and we've got the whole nation represented here, we work very much in our local communities, be they metropolitan or region. What message might you give to TAFE around what are we going to see in the regions as we've seen this exit of some young people into the regions? And I'm assuming when you say young people, you're talking about people really around that below 40 age group as You know, the working population, at the right heart of young families, which is a big part of the TAFE training agenda, is actually people in their mid-20s to 40. We don't just deal with the youth coming through school. We deal with that critical group of people trying to skill up or reskill or gain new skills for their careers. What sort of messaging would you give to those TAFEs here who are driving regional TAFEs as to what they might expect to see in the next period?
Well, if they're in this unexpected but happy circumstance of increased demand for places, they need to be scaling up. That's almost the obvious point. But you think about the mission in the regions. This is not to discount what happens in the cities, but the mission in the regions is to maintain the viability of the regions. And in the end, the only way to maintain the viability of the region is to slow the ageing process. Because the difficulty you have if ageing gets away from you, and there's some areas now, there's some regions in Australia where the proportion of the population aged 65 and over outnumbers people aged up to 20. And if you think about the labour market demands in a region like that, which is hooked up to just caring, it's very difficult. Caring, and remember the services that sort of luxury and lifestyle services that used to be attached to those cohorts may not be possible in a permanent mask wearing environment for the next few years while we try to avoid the next pandemic. Mission statement, in a sense, for a regional take would be to maintain critical mass of young people in the area, and to be able to build on that to have a sustainable and viable regional community. Now, you know that the unis, especially the regional unis, are always pitching this idea, but there's no reason why the TAFEs can't be in that space and can't be thinking in that space. I know it's partly a political message, but it's an important local community message. The other thing is, if you've got different cohorts, if you've got larger numbers coming, they're coming from city to country, you may well have an untapped cohort there that hasn't thought to do TAFE. And I think that changes the nature of how you position yourself in the local area. Again, as I say, I sort of repeat this point. The aging, if you get your head around the aging dynamic, remember we fell below replacement in 1976. It's a long, long time ago. That cohort of baby boomers started to retire the first cohort of baby boomers started to retire in 2011. The labour market has been sourcing, as we know, for the last 10 years. The majority of new jobs being created have been going to overseas born. Not because they're bumping local born out of the workforce, but because there were more boomers leaving than new entrants in the labour force from the local born population. That problem's going to re-emerge. But within your regions, and this is the thing, you're almost in a position of lock-in. You've got these little bubbles of growth, unexpected growth in regional areas, because a whole lot of people are turning up for the first time, which you didn't expect to have. And they're not going the other way, by the way. They're not leaving for the cities.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Okay.
No, you finished, George. My apologies.
Yeah, look, there's just one thing, and this is almost starts a new conversation. But if you think about the next federal election in terms of the funding, the auction between coalition and Labor, there is something that happens at the tail end of a long-term Conservative government, which is a bit counterintuitive, but it's the survival mechanism kicks in. And it happened in 2007. Remember Kevin Rudd ran that education revolution policy? And then suddenly John Howard and Peter Costello found what was an extra $5 billion or something, which was banged into an education future fund. I don't know what Labor's up to, but if Labor are bidding big on education, they're bidding big on universities and TAFE. Remember that they're trying to run those two things together. You may, weirdly, even though we've been in a constrained environment and the last federal budget didn't really do, in fact, there seemed to be a bit of a, we'll put higher education to one side and just forget about it. There may well be, by the time the next election comes around, the possibility of once in a decade bidding more. Once in a long electoral cycle bidding more. That is the other thing to think about when you think about how you divvy up the messaging between capitals and regions.
Thank you, George. And I think your messaging around, the growth in aged care and the growth in the health sector, we've known that for a long time, pre-pandemic. Yes. And so that challenge has been a big challenge for all of us sitting in the skills training arena for many years now, in terms of needing resources to deliver and meeting unmet demand in that area. And now it's just exploded even further.
Yes. It's front of mind for everyone now. And remember, look, this sounds obvious, but always think about providing as much information as you can to every level of government, and provide it as the most friendly way possible. You're not asking for anything. You're letting them into a window into how dynamic and how difficult some of these challenges are. Most governments, regardless of ideological leading, will at the end of the day want to know what's happening on the ground. And your better information source on some of the stuff than some of the surveys that they rely on, some of the polling material they get, which has a time lag built into it.
Good advice. Thank you very much, George. Thank you for your time this morning, for a very stimulating presentation, and we appreciate that enormously.
Thank you all.